In this edition of the Bucs Report, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers take on the Falcons this weekend. What are the implications? We'll talk about all of that and more next on this edition of the Bucs Report. Let's go! Well, hello and welcome into this edition of the Bucs Report. I'm so glad you decided to join me today. As always, this podcast is free and available on all the major platforms. You can find this podcast on the Bucs Report. Just check it out online at bucsreport.com. You can also find it on YouTube, but just search for the Bucs Report. My name is Dan Holme. You can find me on Twitter. It's at DanCaps218. You can find the show on Twitter. It's at Bucs Minutecast. So in this edition of the Bucs Report, we're happy to have Rachel West with us. Rachel, welcome to the show.
Hello. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Thanks for joining us. So the implications of this game Sunday, it doesn't seem like they're that great. The Bucs have already clinched the NFC South, but for me, what's at stake is risking injury to other players that are kind of on the fringe, that are kind of slowly working their way back. I could think of no worst case scenario than like Tom Brady, Mike Evans, something like that getting injured. What are your thoughts about Todd Bowles saying that he wants to play the starters primarily this weekend?
Yeah, it's funny because I feel like this time last week we were going into the Carolina game with all implications on the line, everything at stake. Now this week, total flip of the script here. Totally opposite situation where playoff situation there's no bearings on this game on the playoff situation. And really what we have here with Todd Bowles and the coaching staff's decision is just the classic risk versus reward situation here. So do you risk it and play all your starters, kind of try to carry that momentum into the playoffs and wild card weekend next week? Or, rest them, make sure they're all healthy, ready to go for whether it be the Eagles or Cowboys, whoever they end up hosting here. Really, though, from talking with the coaches and especially the players, too, you kind of get an overwhelming sense that they have that excitement, that they do want to go out there and they want to carry over that momentum. And then at the end of the day, player-wise, it all comes down to Tom Brady. Tom Brady does what Tom Brady wants. And Tom Brady wants to play. So Tom Brady will be playing at least at the start of this game. He's noted several times over this past week that, he sat out, obviously, the season he got injured, tore his ACL. And then he always likes to throw in, those 4 games, too, back in 2016 during the whole Deflategate suspension. He very eloquently says everything without saying anything when it comes to that topic. But like I said, at the end of the day, he wants to be out there and he wants to prepare for this game like any other game throughout the season. So that's what they'll be doing.
For me, what I think it's about, and far be it from me to ever say anything negatively about Tom Brady, the GOAT, but this is primarily about him having a winning record at the end of the season. He has never had a season where he didn't have a winning record as a starter. But he understands the implications of this. He is keenly aware of the risks he played in 2009 regular season finale against Houston, even though the Patriots playoff seeding had been determined. Then New England lost receiver Wes Welker to torn knee ligaments. And that's what's kind of drawn into focus for me, is this is ostensibly the last season for Tom Brady in the NFL, and most likely with the Buccaneers. Is it worth risking everything just for pride? That's what it boils down to, is pride. He's not happy with ending the season at 500. He wants to have a winning season. Is that what it's really all about for you?
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, he's never had a losing season in his career, so certainly doesn't want to go out on that kind of note. I think that a lot of the guys have a strong sense of wanting to make this a winning season for Todd Bowles as a first-year coach. Obviously, he's been through the thick of it here in this season. And they want to kind of do this for him and show like, yeah, maybe the Bucs did make the right decision in making him the head coach after Arians left last year. So like I said, I don't know. Who knows? I think hindsight is always 2020. And Tom Brady said that throughout the week as well. So say all the starters go out there this week, one of them goes down. I mean, you can always look back on it and say, what if? But if you're constantly playing that what if game and you're constantly going out there scared, I mean, you just can't play that way. So they're just going to kind of, go as they normally do and hope for the best.
So Todd Bowles did say that he's not ruling out the possibility of going with Gabbert and then possibly Trask after that. For me, I'd ultimately like to see what the Bucs have in Trask. He's been redshirted his entire career. As we talked about, this is most likely Tom Brady's last season with the Bucs and the NFL. Maybe he's got something up his sleeve. We never know. But I would like to know what they have in Kyle Trask before they go into the offseason. Are they going to go out and draft a quarterback? Are they going to go into the free agent market? You've got to be a bit curious as well as to see what they have in Trask. Ultimately, I know what they have in Gabbert. He's a solid backup, but Trask, he's a bit more intriguing for me.
Absolutely. And I think just as equally intriguing for the coaching staff, who has been extremely complimentary of him and his work ethic. Todd Bowles saying the other day, he has the greatest resolve and toughness of any player he's ever seen. Going out there, he's always the first one out on the field at practice. He's out there getting extra reps, putting in extra time. So it will be really interesting to see if that does end up translating. And obviously, we all know Kyle Trask, this is kind of his MO. He has done this whole backup thing a time or two, obviously not being the starter throughout high school and then taking several years into college when he was at the University of Florida to become the starter there. So he knows this role pretty well. So he knows how to prepare in these types of situations. And it'll certainly be interesting to see, assuming he does end up getting into this game, if, all of this preparation, hard work, and practice does translate over to regular season game reps. Because as you're saying, who knows what is to come at the end of this season. And if Tom Brady is not what's to come at the end of this season, then you're looking at Blaine Gabbert and Kyle Trask here and making the decision between them, or if you want to go outside and try to bring someone else in. But it'd definitely be good to know what you're working with before you have to make that decision.
In one of the interesting stats out there I saw, Greg Amman posted this, is the Bucs are 8-8, and they're also 6-2 against teams with losing records right now, and 1-4 against teams with winning records, 1-2 against 500 teams. Early losses to Carolina and Pittsburgh don't look as bad now as those two were combined 2-9. But for me, all games are kind of must-win games. But what it boils down to me is I always hear people say, well, they're going to be playing this poor team, so they're going to win. Forget about all that. I want this team to beat some of the best teams in the league because that's what you're going to do if you're going to win the Super Bowl. So that's what it's all about. As we take a look at the possibilities of who the Bucs are playing, who would you like to see them face in the first round?
Yeah, honestly, I think it's a bit of a toss-up because you can kind of look at both teams and say, well, they both have their pros, they both have their cons. I mean, obviously, we don't fully know, like with Philly and the Eagles, Jalen Hurts' status right now, questionable going into this week. I have to assume come playoff time, if he's questionable now, come playoffs, he's going to be out there. But that's obviously a huge factor in that potential matchup. And then it would be a rematch of last year's wild card round, where obviously the Bucs did beat them pretty handedly last year. So the Bucs would certainly have some confidence going into that as a home game, hosting them again in Ray J. Then on the flip side of things, you can look at Dallas and say, yeah, they beat them in week 1. And that was on the road at Dallas, a tough environment to play in. And have a lot of things happen to the Bucs from week 1 to week 18, absolutely. But at the end of the day, it's the playoffs, and these guys have playoff experience. They know how to get the job done. So I'm certainly not going to be counting them out in that. And Dallas has shown they've struggled over the past few weeks, close calls with Houston and losing to Jacksonville. So, no one's invincible in this league. It's certainly a week-to-week league. And when you have Tom Brady and some of the other stars that this Bucs team has, I wouldn't write them off against anybody.
Yeah, because I always remember back to when he was playing for the Patriots in the Super Bowl against the Falcons, and they were behind by a large margin. I want to say this was like 5 years ago. And Tom Brady and the Patriots mounted a huge comeback, one of the biggest comebacks in NFL history. So I would never count anything out as far as the GOAT is concerned. All right, so after the break here, we will talk about the great game with that Mike Evans and Tom Brady had combined. We'll talk about that next. All right, welcome back into this edition of the Bucs Report. In this edition, we are joined by Rachel West. In this next segment here, we are going to talk about the great play of Mike Evans. You know, Mike Evans hasn't been targeted as much, and maybe, he hasn't been totally in lockstep with the routes, but Brady was 34 for 45, 3 touchdowns, 432 yards. Mike Evans, 3 touchdowns for 207 yards, 10 receptions. With his 3 touchdowns last Sunday, Mike Evans has exactly 500 points scored. Only players with more in Bucs history is Martin, and I have his last name cut off here, and Michael Husted. So it's quite a record that Mike Evans is holding out there right now. It's kind of interesting. Mike Evans is kind of like the number 1 or number 2 target for Tom Brady, but until the last game, he hasn't seen quite as much action, or he hasn't been quite as noticeable on the field. What's your assessment of that?
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with, Mike talked a lot about last week. He had the one-on-one coverage. Carolina's defense was playing in man coverage, whereas a lot of teams do double team him because they know that if they don't, then you get the 200-plus yard games and the 3 touchdowns, him and Brady connecting on those deep passes. So I think a lot of it's just the opportunity hasn't been there. And, there has been a lot of, Brady and Evans, their connections off, because on the rare times when that possibility is there and Evans is open downfield, the mistakes become more glaring when there's limited opportunities. So I think last week we just saw he had a lot more opportunity, and it also too, the first attempt that he had that game, he did drop, but Brady and him were able to go back to that and figure it out, and clearly they figured something out that worked and clicked pretty well, and I'm sure those two would love to see that connection just continue on into this week and then the playoffs, and the Bucs would certainly love to see that too, because those connections mean a lot of points for them, which is something that they are in desperate need of this year.
Yeah, and it was one of the funny things Chris Godwin was saying. He was speaking highly of Mike Evans, and he's like, I'm going to say this for him because I know he won't say it for himself, but what just an outstanding player he is on this team. Also just a really great guy in the community in Tampa there as well. Tom Brady was honest. He said, Tom Brady says he has missed Mike Evans too many times this year, so it was good to hit him today. They're talking about last week, and Brady says he thinks they can keep that going. Mike is the first Buccaneers ever to record 200 receiving yards and 3 touchdowns in a single game. So those are quite the accolades. Those are quite the accomplishment. If the Bucs can keep that going, if they can keep Evans, if they can keep Godwin engaged, I think, there's a pretty good chance for this team in the playoffs, despite everything that's been said. A lot of this has to do with the myriad of injuries facing this team, and that kind of all started with Ryan Jensen. But, it would be something if the Bucs could get some of these players back in the playoffs at some point. But they are playing better, even though it seems like they'll win by a large margin and then they'll lose a game that they should have won. The one thing I guess I'll say about this season's Bucs team is an identity. Are they winners? Are they losers? It kind of seems to be 50-50, and that would kind of stand to reason with their 500 record.
Yeah, for sure. No, if anything can be said about this season, it is the definition of a roller coaster of a year. Just when you think, they're falling off the cliff, they come right back and surprise you and pull out a game like they did with all those crazy offensive stats last week against Carolina. So it'll certainly be interesting to see how they continue. And I think it's weird because we are at week 18 of the season and we still don't really know what their identity is, because they have gone back and forth so much. But like we were kind of touching on earlier, when you have guys like Tom Brady and Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, guys who know how to win and know how to get the job done when their backs are up against the wall in the most pressure-packed of situations. I mean, they're going to find a way to come out on top and ultimately prevail, I think.
Yeah, and that's what we're hoping for. To kind of prove everyone wrong, everyone's kind of panned this team, this season's team anyway, as not being able to go anywhere. I guess if there's any bright spot, if the Bucs in fact do not go with all their starters, is to see what they have in some of the players that haven't seen as much activity. You can see Keyshawn Vaughn, Giovanni Bernard, those kind of players that haven't seen as much action. Because there's one thing that's going to be said is that when Brady's on this team, he has a true magnetism that kind of brought some of these top tier players to this team. When he's gone, it's going to be interesting to see how many of those players will want to re-sign if they're up on their contracts up. Or if the other players want to go on to other teams. So it would be prudent, I think, for the Bucs to see what they have in some of their depth players, because that might be who they're relying on next season.
100% for sure. It's always nice to know what you're working with going before it's too late. As they kind of have come to see this year with, their offensive line, they didn't expect all those losses, and I'm not going to say it's definitely not been the only problem this year, but it's certainly been one of the more problematic things for them. Had they known you can't expect, or, you can't know that Ali Marpet's going to up and retire, and you can't know that Ryan Jensen's going to go down on the second day of training camp. But, if they had more of an opportunity in the past to kind of like look at things and assess and evaluate where they were, who knows, maybe that would have changed their draft approach or what they did with free agent signings. So certainly this week could be a big week for them to kind of learn those things about a good amount of different positions on the team. I know one of the guys that I'm sure is going to probably get a few more snaps this week than normal, Logan Hall, their first draft pick this past year, who was seeing some playing time, but then that dropped once some guys came back from injury a bit. But the coaches speak incredibly highly of him. They say his ceiling is as high as he wants it to be. It's just how much he wants to get there. So he's certainly going to be a guy who I think you're going to be seeing getting a lot more reps. And of course, the defensive line is always a rotation anyways, so that might not change too much. But I think if there's anyone on that line that they're looking at, seeing what he can do, given more opportunity, it's probably going to be him.
Yeah, and one of the kind of pleasant surprises, too, on this team is Jake Camarda. If we remember, that botched punt Sunday wasn't just instincts on his part. They had not practiced that situation. Bowles says, I have never seen a punter make an athletic play like that. That was one of the things that I watched again and again. I couldn't believe it. So it was a botched punt. He ran with the football, and then he ended up punting it. It was an unbelievable play. When I watched that game, when you saw that, and, maybe it wasn't something that kind of glazed over me when I watched it at first, but to watch that in isolation, that was quite an impressive play. That is the kind of play that the Buccaneers are going to need to win some of these games. I know they've won quite a few games this season based on field goals. So you got to get points where you can get them. And it helps to have someone like Jake Camarda on your team to kind of really step up and help in a situation like that. That's nothing fancy, like a touchdown or an interception, something like that.
Absolutely. It was funny when Todd Bowles was saying that, because he's like, I've never seen a punter make an athletic play like that. And then we were kind of like, oh, funny, like you're being sarcastic. He's like, no, really, I've never seen that in my life. Todd Bowles has seen some football in his day. So yeah, to have a kicker back there like that, who's able to run to the opposite side of the field, kick it with his non-dominant foot down to the 1 yard line. I mean, just, it's crazy. And it goes to show you how helpful having those types of guys and those just pure athletes and who have kind of just the football sense and know what they need to do in those moments, how helpful that is to win games. And that's ultimately what allows you to win these tight, close playoff games, which is what they were looking at last week as. So, and as you said too, like special teams has played such a huge factor in a lot of games this year, good and bad. So to have him back there as kind of a steadying force, if anything goes wrong, you have trust in him. So that's better to have him than not.
All right, so after the break here, we will talk about the breakout season of Rachaad White, and then we'll talk about the coaching situation. We'll talk about that next. All right, welcome back into this edition of the Bucs Report. In this edition, we have Rachel West on the show. So one of the pleasant surprises for me on this team is Rachaad White kind of almost stole the job away from Leonard Fournette. Not really. I mean, you need more than one running back, but he has been playing better than I think anyone expected. Give me your thoughts on Rachaad White and where you see him playing next year and seasons to come.
Yeah, huge Rachaad White fan here. He is just a kid who ever since day one has just shown up and he puts in the work. Obviously nobody expected him to have the kind of season that he's having so far. But I think that hard work that he has put in is paying off. We're seeing the result of all of that. And I think moving forward, sky's the limit for him, probably. Eventually down the road, one day, who knows, Leonard Fournette's no longer going to be here. So the whole controversy of, should White be getting more snaps? Should Lenny be getting more snaps? That's eventually going to go away. And it's kind of going to be Rachaad's show. And I think he's proving in his rookie year now that he's more than ready to step into that when needed. Obviously, I mean, people think that he should be playing all the time over Lenny already. So I think Bucs running back is probably not going to be a major issue for them moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, you take a look at, I know statistically they're not ranked towards the top, but if you look at Leonard Fournette, then you look at Rachaad White, you can even put Keyshawn Vaughn. I mean, there is even depth in that position, I guess I would say. One of the good things about Leonard Fournette is he is a huge man, so he is a difficult person to take down. You see many times where he kind of throws people off him or people give him the stiff arm. So that is one of the pleasant surprises on this team going forward. There are some other questions coming up next year in the wide receiver position. I mean, who is ultimately, there's people that were on the fringe, like Scotty Miller, for example, who they were wondering if he was going to even break camp with this team. Talk to me a little bit about the depth on some other positions. Let's take the wide receiver position in general. We know we got Godwin. We know we have Evans out there, but some of the more depth players, who do you see returning next year?
Yeah, I think with them, it's kind of been tough this year to kind of evaluate them because they've been so in and out of the lineup. Julio Jones is questionable seemingly every week, and whether he's going to play, I mean, who knows? Russell Gage has kind of been the same way. When they're both in there, they have a positive impact, and they make good plays. The other week, Russell Gage really had a good game, and with them, it obviously helps when you have Evans and you have Godwin in there who are kind of, taking the double teams and they're taking all the defense's attention, putting it on them. And so it kind of opens it up for that third guy, whoever it is. You mentioned Scotty Miller. We've seen glimpses of him a little bit this year, more so in the past. I think they definitely all have their roles. It's just kind of how the game plan and how the game's going that week. And I think, too, it boils down to how Tom is feeling with them going into that game, throughout that game. That connection, I think, determines a lot of who he looks to target. So if they're clicking, then they're clicking. But if they're not, they're not. And then, of course, Rashad Perriman's another one who's in there who, he's had his moments as well. Not so much this year. But he's definitely a guy that is in that room and Tom Brady trusts. And I think all the coaches, they have a lot of faith and trust in him as well. So it has been interesting, though, because we haven't even really seen it get down to the Perrymans and the Millers. And it has more been Julio and Russell Gage kind of factoring in as that third receiver role.
All right, Rachel, I know I only have you here for a short period of time, but so to wrap it up here a little bit, why don't you tell everyone where we can find your work?
Yeah, so on the World Wide Web, the wonderful internet, Sports by Tampa Bay Times, is the Twitter account that I kind of, run and keep track of. So that's where we have all the Tampa Bay Times writers, beat writers, Rick Stroud, Joey Knight, all their great Bucs coverage is on there. And then me personally, also on Twitter, it's at Rachel West, and then it's 2 underscores because I have a very basic name, so I had to throw that second underscore under there. So yeah, predominantly, but Twitter, and then of course all the other socials as well, Instagram, Facebook. And then we also have a YouTube page, so all of our videos eventually wind up on there as well.
Yeah, and I enjoy your coverage. I follow you on Twitter there, but it's got to be fun kind of working with Rick Stroud as well and Joey Knight. The podcast is a go-to podcast for me every morning. Sports Day Tampa Bay, just really good information on the Bucs, and then of course your work on Twitter as well. It's a good follow. So Rachel, once again, thank you for joining us on this edition of the Bucs Report. It was a real honor to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Enjoyed it.
All right, I'll talk to you guys again next time. Thanks for listening.